We have a special guest with us now. First of all, I'm here standing in for our fearless president, Ed, who's been summoned suddenly to go on to CNN to bring some sense to that network. And I think this is going to be a, regular occurrence from now on. And I'm happy to stand in. But we are so very fortunate to have a longtime friend of our organization, Ambassador Faith Whittlesey. Faith was an early adopter of Ronald Reagan, and for that reason, she went right into the White House on January 20th, 1981, with the new president, where she upheld the banner of conservatism when you might say a few moderates were brought in to kind of run the show, people like James Baker, and Faith was reminding everyone why President Reagan was elected, and she was so successful at that they made her ambassador to Switzerland so that she would be out of the way a little bit. But then they realized she needed to come back to be again to the White House for a second time, and then she returned again as ambassador to Switzerland. Schlafly, by the way, is a Swiss name. My father's grandfather was born in Switzerland. Faith is here today with her granddaughter, Catherine O'Neill, who was on the Trump transition team and is now at the State Department. Faith Whittlesey is affiliated with, among other things, the Institute of World Politics of Dr. John Ledenchowski, which is an outstanding organization, and also the Rockford Institute, publisher of Chronicles magazine, another outstanding organization. And earlier this year, last year, she became one of the almost the very few people who Phyllis ever turned over the Phyllis Schlafly report for another author when she wrote an article on the similarities between Reagan and Trump as she saw it. It was an outstanding, prescient article, and so Faith is here with us today, and she really has a perspective that almost no one else can bring to us about the new administration and the difficulties of any new administration to stand up for the values and the things that brought the president to the White House. Faith, will you come up and join us? Ambassador Faith Whittlesey.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the Eagle Forum. It is really an honor for me to be among you, the heroes and heroines of the pro-life movement. And I want to also thank Ed Martin for inviting me here today. I'm so proud of him every time I see him on CNN and other networks. He does an outstanding job. And I'm so glad that my old friends, Kathleen Sullivan and Najla Latif, are here. Hello, Najla. And Kathleen, the honor you received last night was so richly deserved. Congratulations. I'm also very proud of my granddaughter. I have 10 grandchildren, 3 girls and 7 boys. And Catherine, would you stand up, Catherine, please? Catherine has gone through the Trump transition, started work on the Hill as a volunteer, and ended up on the 7th floor of the State Department, where she's doing very good work. But because of the strict rules of government service, she is not allowed to speak unless she gets clearance from all the higher-ups. So she will remain silent today, and I will speak. But I'm sure you'd much rather hear from a 23-year-old than from me. But I will do my very best. I knew Phyllis for years and years. We were good friends. And And I supported President Trump from the very beginning. I'm a Florida resident. I got to know him down at Mar-a-Lago. And I've known him for about 7 years. So I agreed with my dear friend and far-sighted friend Phyllis that in all that Republican lineup, he was the only one who had a chance of defeating Hillary Clinton, which was my primary goal. And lo and behold, it worked. Phyllis was right, as she usually was. There were two issues that were vitally important to me in the 2016 election. They were first the pro-life, Donald Trump's pro-life position, and the second, his skepticism about military interventionism, in particular the Iraq War, which he voiced on virtually every campaign stop. I was not always pro-life. Years ago, I was not. The pro-choice position was really the conventional wisdom among young lawyers of the time. I was a practicing lawyer in the city of Philadelphia. But once I was elected to the Pennsylvania State House, I was moved by the cogent, gentle arguments of my pro-life colleagues to rethink my pro forma earlier embrace of radical feminist orthodoxy on life. And I became pro-life. And one of the results was that when I did get to the White House as a member of Ronald Reagan's senior staff, we managed to show the movie The Silent Scream in the White House when I headed the Office of Public Liaison there. And if some of you are too young to remember that, as many of you may be, it was a movie, a video produced and narrated by one of our great heroes now passed on, Dr. Nathanson, which showed the sufferings of a baby in the womb as it was aborted. And just a little side piece of information, there were insiders then too, and they tried to stop the showing of that film the very morning of its showing by saying to me, "Faith, this is a very controversial project you're undertaking." And I said, "Yes, sir, but it is the president's position." And we showed the film to a packed house in room 450. So I encourage you, gentle ladies and gentlemen of the pro-life movement, not to despair in the face of seemingly implacable opposition and the relentless decadence of the popular culture. Press on with your quiet, friendly explanations about the sanctity of human life to those who cross your life path. Without persuasive friends in my own life, I would have stayed in the wilderness. I might have. And those who cherish life would have had one less soldier for the cause. I believe President Trump is committed to the pro-life cause too. Like me, he is a convert, more fully committed for having grappled with the question. And as a result, we can count on seeing more good judicial appointments. We pray the defunding of Planned Parenthood and the passage of the heartbeat bill. The second reason for my ardent support of Donald Trump is connected to the first. I do not believe one can be pro-life and not feel deep concern about the ongoing wars we have been engaged in now for decades. The human suffering caused by these decades of war has been immense and has been largely hidden from our eyes on purpose by the insiders who initiated these wars, such as the civilian casualties, the returning coffins, just to name two. Our soldiers and their families, as have countless innocent civilians, have borne the brunt. Not only does war produce grievously wounded warriors, casualties, and broken families, war has unintended consequences. For example, our bombing of Libya to rubble has resulted in thousands of African immigrants trying to reach Europe and drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, a tragedy that continues unabated. After our invasion of Iraq, we witnessed the virtual demise of Christianity there. There used to be 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Now there are less than 200,000. Donald Trump was the only candidate other than Senator Rand Paul, who exited early, who stated forcefully that the Iraq War was an imprudent use of American blood and treasure. He promised war-weary Americans that he would not engage in regime change wars of choice. He said scarce American resources should be used instead to rebuild our own country. Interestingly, the states that were critical in his victory, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, even Missouri, were in the front rank of those that had suffered the most casualties. By November 2016, Middle America had become deeply suspicious of our national institutions, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, the defense industry. That is, the permanent state in our nation's capital that initiated and now continually advocates for the preeminence of our formidable military power, even glorification of it over all other types of statecraft. Donald Trump referred to Washington as the swamp and resolved to do some serious draining. There was a misbelieving mood in the heartland, a belief that these wars waged at astronomical cost in life and wealth resulted in virtually no gain in security for Americans. Also, there seemed to be no accountability, none, on the part of the Washington political class from both parties who caused us to enter these wars. And we are now, as a consequence, deeply in debt, running north of 20 trillion. We have been building hospitals and bridges around the world, but our own infrastructure was and still is crumbling. Donald Trump was the only candidate to make these points. Fearless man that he is. The smear of isolationism leveled against Donald Trump didn't stick with voters, although it is still used frequently in Washington by insiders to discredit proponents of any policy review. But the voters seem to know that we could not afford to pursue regime change around the world. We needed our sons and brothers here to rebuild our own grids and roads, and could not afford to let allies and others be virtual free riders as we maintained an expansive, expensive global hegemony. It just isn't sustainable for us as a nation in the long run. You may disagree with my analysis. The donor class, the never-Trumpers, the Washington insiders certainly would. But they were soundly defeated as the Make America Great Again coalition swept to electoral victory last November 8th. My view, I believe, was and is shared by many traditional patriotic conservative Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And here we are, 8 months after the inauguration of Donald Trump. Where do we stand? The permanent Washington political class, supported by friends in the media, is horrified that an outsider who would challenge policy orthodoxy and establishment monopoly on policymaking is in office. Hence, the unrelenting campaign to sell the fake Russia collusion story, to call the president a misogynist, a white supremacist, a racist, to cripple, weaken, and neuter him, to make it impossible for him to carry out his campaign promises and to force him to conform to their failed policies. Because he has tried to temporarily limit travel from war-torn countries that can't vouch for the reliability of their documents, he has insisted that NATO allies pay their promised shares of the common defense. He has been vilified, both here and especially in Europe. Hungary and some other Eastern European countries are exceptions because they have lived under Turkish domination. Hungary, for example, which lived under Muslim occupation for 150 years, is a particular target of European Union wrath because of its refusal to accept EU quotas of Muslim refugees. Trump is accused by the globalist establishment of not understanding the value of our longstanding alliances and of the pejorative unilateralism. But after decades of conflicts, dreadful losses, and no end in sight, is not skepticism justified? And review of our international commitments prudent? Withdrawing from the job-killing Paris climate change agreements was another cause for an outpouring of vitriol from the elites on both sides of the Atlantic. As with NATO under the Paris Agreement, the United States would have borne a disproportionate share of the costs. And as many in this room know well, climate change ideology, otherwise known as the weather, is the new religion among secular elites, both here and in Europe. I believe President Trump was right to advocate seeking common ground for accommodation with nuclear-armed Russia. We should not be interfering, a la John McCain, in what is known as Russia's near abroad. We would react badly if a European or Asian power did so in Canada or Mexico, or for that matter, Hawaii or Guam. We have the Monroe Doctrine, after all. If the Ukraine and the Crimea are of so much concern to the future of Europe, why aren't the Europeans stepping up? Why are we sending and paying for our Pennsylvania National Guard to go to the Russian border in war games? And if our military aircraft are overflying Russian coasts, should we not expect a reaction? China may be a possible adversary in the future. I pray not. But isn't it better not to have both Russia and China as adversaries? Another reason the elites don't like Putin and try to block any cooperation that Trump might wish to have with him. Putin will not tolerate the active promotion by secular elites of agendas in his country contrary to Russian traditional moral codes. In accordance with resurgent Russian Orthodox Christianity, Putin bristles at the promotion of Western decadence in his country. Western decadence, otherwise known as we heard last night from David Horowitz, cultural Marxism. The relentless demonization of Russia, especially when compared to our coziness with far worse human rights abusers, Saudi Arabia, for example, I believe is a grave error. But it is the constantly reiterated narrative of the bipartisan Washington political class. At the end, the great tragedy of the fake collusion story is that our relations have worsened. I suggest we would be better served by having Russia as an ally in the struggle against the advance of radical Islam and to balance the rise of China. Regrettably, there have been conflicting statements about Syria from the administration. Syria, an ally of Russia. Here we are again fighting another regime change proxy war that has caused floods of desperate refugees to seek entry into Europe from a country almost totally destroyed by bombing. Should our officials tell the world who should or should not be the leaders of other countries, for example, in the case of Syria and Assad? Do most Americans know that most of the Christians in Syria, of which there are many, support Assad? Has that fact been kept from us? Every regime change we've engaged in the past has resulted in worse conditions, not better. Iraq, Libya, now Yemen, now Syria. I appreciate that the subject of North Korea is sensitive, but please hear me out. Many of the very same people who brought us the Iraq War now urge what amounts to preemptive war on the Korean Peninsula, upon rather flimsy grounds, asserting provocation, that is, that North Korea is a danger to us because North Korea is proliferating and trading weapons with Iran and might sometime in the future be able to strike Japan or Guam with its third-rate ballistic missiles. Consider, conditions in the region have changed considerably since the Korean War in the 50s. South Korea has become a very rich country. So has Japan. China is also rich, rising and seeking world recognition in its sphere. And the current government of South Korea doesn't like our belligerence very much. We don't hear that on the news. Does Congress question why we still have 30,000 U.S. troops in South Korea 70 years after the war there, and another 30,000 or more in Japan? South Korea is right now asking us for more very expensive military equipment. Can we afford this? Why shouldn't these wealthy nations take up this challenge in their own neighborhood with their own resources? Is it necessary for our long-term security to continue permanent occupations of the North Pacific, especially considering the rapid rise of China and our own very serious budget constraints? Both South Korea and Japan possess formidable militaries, and they have economies built under the protection of American power that could sustain even more formidable forces. As to nuclear weapons, Britain and France and other allies, such as Israel, have nukes. India and Pakistan share borders. Both have nukes and have been thus dissuaded from open conflict for years. Why not allow Japan to develop nuclear capability to ensure deterrence on the Korean Peninsula? I'm told the Japanese could have nukes in a few months. In fact, Henry Kissinger told me at a dinner about 20 years ago that the Japanese were so far away, less than an inch away from having them. This, instead of starving the poor people of North Korea, and it is the people who will suffer, not the leadership, with harsh, punitive sanctions. Just an alternative to consider. Another example, Afghanistan. We are supporting seemingly permanent occupation. Donald Trump was right during the campaign to state we should leave. Once elected, however, he did resist heavy pressure to escalate. Now at least we're sending only 5,000 soldiers instead of tens of thousands, as the permanent state clique and the generals advocated to him internally. The president remains under heavy pressure to keep us in Afghanistan permanently. These individual cases are examples of a deep underlying disagreement as to what should be America's role in the world. Are we to be the sole guarantor of the global political order in every region of the world by intervening in every dispute, every conflict? Does the world see this as benign? Probably not, even if we do think we're always the good guys. Where in our Constitution is our mandate to police and reshape the world? Are there other factors driving this push for conflict? Remember Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, who warned us about the dangers and the power of the military-industrial complex. Another president, President John Quincy Adams, asserted that we should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, but rather attend to our own problems, lead by example. In short, our national interests more narrowly, not broadly defined. American historical literacy is not great in these times. Does anyone study history anymore? But anyone who does study history knows that every empire of the past has fallen because of overextension. Just think, the British, the Soviet, the Japanese, the Spanish, the French, the Austro-Hungarian in World War I, the Roman. And just now, the Congress has doubled President Trump's request for increased military spending from $50 billion to $100 billion. And I heard one of our pundits say on television last night that it should go up to $150 billion increase. And of course, we have Puerto Rico in ruins, and Florida and Texas. And the question is, how deep in bankruptcy are we prepared to go? All the talk in the conservative talk radio, the Blaze TV, Hillsdale Symposia, and other platforms emphasize the importance of being a constitutional conservative. But all these conversations leave out one very key question. That is, constitutional restrictions on war making. Only the body closest to the people, the Congress, according to our Constitution, has the power to declare war. Why are there no votes? Not even any congressional debates on these subjects. Why was the Tea Party movement silent? Does our Constitution, with its constraining balancing of power provisions, hold any meaning today? The founders had experience with rulers and kings who waged countless European wars. The founders wanted the people, through their elected representative, to exercise a check on war making. But today we hear, oh, remember the 1930s. I just heard that this morning. Another one on my iPhone 6. Oh, we must be prepared to confront the wicked. But isn't it up to our Congress to ask up front, at what cost in American blood and treasure? And what might be the unintended consequences? Senator Rand Paul, to his credit, recently tried to explain this and offered a resolution requiring the Congress to vote on our ongoing wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, also with Libya and against ISIS. His resolution failed. Why did the Congress reject Senator Paul's initiative that would have forced a vote? Might the congressman think their constituents would not like a pro-war vote, or even a vote which would cause the wisdom of constitutional war declarations to be openly debated on the floor? Ladies and gentlemen of the Eagle Forum, most of you have considerable political influence. Many, if not most of you, probably do not agree with me. I urge you, however, to consider thinking and raising questions about our forever wars with elected officials as you advocate for our various conservative causes. Traditional conservatism, as I learned it, does not require the unending seeking out of adversaries in the world far away from American shores. Conservatism used to stand for strong civilian control of the military, holding very dear the lives and limbs of our precious soldiers, attending to rebuilding our often broken families, rebuilding our towns and cities, raising the next generation of virtuous citizens, fighting battles here at home for our unique and priceless American heritage now under daily assault. Our resources are not limitless. Many of you will be influenced by the argument repeated again in past years, we must fight them abroad or fight them here. I submit that Donald Trump was right when he asserted in the campaign that our policies of continuous military interventions have not made us safer, but instead have arguably backfired. The more we invade and drone bomb, the more disruption occurs, the more generational hatreds we create, and the more we bankrupt future generations of American citizens. There are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. We are approximately 320 million. It is difficult to foresee how we can, by military force and targeted killing, which is our current policy, subdue 1.7 billion potential adversaries. China, with whom we are now at odds over North Korea, has 1.3 billion. President Trump has the right instincts. He does not want perpetual war. I know that. He is a businessman. He's not an expert in world history, but he knows the dangers. He is trying to get a much-needed travel ban. He also knows in his heart that if we do engage in more hot wars, thousands, if not millions, especially in Korea, will die. More Americans will lose more freedom as more citizen surveillance becomes the norm, and his domestic program will go up in the smoke of war. My hope is that we can convey to him our hopes that he follow his own best instincts and campaign promises by putting Americans first and rebuilding America first, and that the protection of human life should be our very first priority. Thank you kindly for your attention.